So what we've talked about up till this point has been what's a story, what's a situation, and defining the moral component elements of a story that constitute the narrative engine of a book or a movie or anything else or a 30-second TV commercial. This is really the most important thing in the course, is this idea of the emotional chain of change and the moral component. But they don't exist in a vacuum, a theoretical vacuum. They actually exist in the framework of story structure. And my approach to how the middle of a story works may be a little different than what a lot of people assume what the middle even means. The middle is not just a range of pages. If you've got a certain number of pages, just figure out the first 25, the last 25, the rest of it's all the middle, or some other variation of that, maybe first 50 pages, last 50 pages. No, the middle of your book is a very precise piece of the structure of your book. Everything between the inciting incident, which we're going to talk about in a minute, the inciting incident and the doom moment, the all is lost moment, however long your book might be, that's the middle. Everything that comes after the doom moment is the last part of the book. It's not the middle. You've got the beginning of the book and you have the end of the book. Those are the bookends. The middle is between that inciting incident and the doom moment. That's the middle. Okay. So what I want to try to convey to you is the idea that all this stuff you've learned about character change, again, isn't happening in a vacuum. It has to happen within the structure of your story, of your book or your screenplay or whatever the hell it is you're writing. It's got structure. If it's a story, it has a very particular structure, but even if it's a situation, it's going to have those 5 basic beats of the classic story structure, which we're going to talk about in a second, or in a little bit. Okay, so all those character change elements we've been talking about, moral component or all of that, that exists within that concept of how you build a story structurally. Think of the chain, for instance, as fitting within the groove of some very particular structures we're going to talk about. And without those grooves, the chain's not going to mean all that much. The chain of change. Okay, you're going to see what I'm talking about in a little bit. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of context that the first part of this course has been to introduce to you how a character changes. And the rest of the course is sort of like, what's the vehicle that allows for that to happen? What's the physical story structure vehicle that the change process is going to use to ride its way from beginning to the end? That's what's kind of unique and original, I think, about this class and this particular formulation of how the middle works. Okay. So without further ado, let's look at some of this theoretically a little bit and practically. The middle, as I say here, is not the hardest problem necessarily. Everyone will find different pieces of the story development process problematic and head scratching and head turning and head exploding. But certainly how you handle the middle is a very, very hard problem. Most people approach the middle in a shatter gun kind of way. I'm not sure if that's the right phrase, but scattergun kind of way, where they just kind of, maybe I'll hit something, maybe this strategy will work, maybe it won't. That's how most people approach it. And they end up caught, lost in the story woods or drowning in the story floodplain because they don't have enough clear direction to take the change process that they just figured out. So the middle is challenging, and it's challenging for everyone. Everyone. The longer the book, the harder the problem, because you have a lot of pages to fill, and the pacing's got to move, especially if you've got a genre story like a horror story or a thriller murder story. There's got to be clues. There's got to be reveals. There's got to be reversals. There's got to be all kinds of complications happening. Red flags, red herrings, all kinds of things going on to keep reader interest, but also to make the adventure interesting and entertaining. Even a quiet, internal, angsty, navel-gazing family drama that all happens in the family library has to have moments that move things forward, that engages the reader in an interesting way, even if it's internal navel gazing. There are some books that actually pull it off. But my point being, this is a toughie. Okay. So again, just to redefine, the middle of your story is not just a piece of geography. in the context of the whole book. First quarter of your book and the last quarter of your book, this is a good rubric to use yourself, or just a good little measurement to use as a standard. Those are basically the bookends. How you get in the book and how you get out of the book. First quarter, last quarter. And most people have a pretty easy time, quote unquote easy, but have an easier time. They know how they're going to get in and they know how they're going to get out. What they don't know is what's going on in the middle, what's going on between those two pieces. That's kind of, if you're going to do it in terms of book geography, that's where it would fit. Okay. So the inciting incident would be happening in that first quarter of the book. And the last quarter of the book is a lot of other steps we're going to talk about in a bit. The middle really is that structural piece of inciting incident to do moment. And the middle isn't just about, more aliens invading and more monsters outside going to eat the kids in the cabin. No, the middle has some very particular story purposes. It's where we learn who the protagonist really is, because we're not going to learn who they really are in the upfront in the first quarter of the book. We're going to see their world. We're going to be introduced to them. We're going to know what their moral component is, because in that first quarter of the book, you want to show us their problem in action on the page. How are they hurting other people? That's something you want to accomplish before the inciting incident. Again, we're going to talk about inciting incident in a second. But that's the first quarter. World building, rules of the game. If you've got a magical world or something like that, that's where you set up most of, or some of the key magical rules of the world, of how the world works, if it's fantasy or magic systems. That's where that first starts happening. We meet the protagonist. We get a sense of what they want, what their goal is. And we introduce some of the other key players in the book. Okay. In the first quarter, wherever that is. Okay. And then we are off to the races with the inciting incident. And that's where we begin to see who they really are as a person, because now you're starting to throw in complications. You're starting to throw in story problems along the way that they have to solve. Remember, they're in their blind spot at this point. They're working out of that core fear they have about who and what they think they are as a person. They're blind to it. La, 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 la. I don't want to see it. But their behavior betrays that. We see the blind spot in action every time they come up against a problem. Choice they make to deal with it is always out of that blind spot, which means it's a bad choice, which leads to a new problem. That's what we call that active protagonist loop, which we talked about earlier. We're going to review that again in a little bit. But we're learning really who they are in this section of the book, because we're watching them fall apart. They're not getting better. They're not getting stronger. They're not turning into a better person. They might have a couple of little hits here and there where it's like, oh my gosh, maybe, but they always slip backward again. That's how we're really learning who they are. The middle is where we really uncover the adventure itself. We learn about the alien invasion. Who are the aliens? Why are they coming? How is this really a problem for the human race, or for the protagonist, or both? The full adventure unfolds before us in this part of the book. Very important. This is where we begin to unfold the subplots. That's a whole other bailiwick, right? Plots, that's a whole other class, which I teach. What constitutes a subplot and what constitutes what we call episodic writing. Subplots happen over the course of the middle, overlapping into the last quarter. Some of the subplots will wrap up later on after the do moment, but most of them are going to wrap up around the do moment or just a little bit past it. But they're really going to unfold, and we're really going to see the subplots taking place in the middle of the book. And this is where we fall in love with the book, with the characters. Are we entertained? Are we not entertained? Do we like who this person is? Do we not like who they are? Do we not like them, but we're rooting for them anyway? That's where you set this up. The middle is your story. It's not just an academic concept. So there's a hell of a lot going on, and you want to create the tools to make it all work. So when we say the mushy middle, when we say, you're trying to avoid this mush, what the heck do we mean by that? It helps to be very clear about what mushy middle even means. Well, the main one is episodic writing. What is episodic writing? I think we talked a little about this earlier, but episodic writing is vignettes. It's when your hero or heroine come up against an opposition, defeat the opposition, win the day, move on to the next opponent. Take that opponent on, have a battle, win that, walk away victorious, come upon the next bad person. There are all these little vignettes that each have their own beginning, middle, and end, that stand alone. There's no interdependence, no cause and effect necessarily between them. Even if there is a little cause and effect, they feel very standalone-ish, like episodes that could, if you pulled them out, wouldn't affect the mainline story at all, or very minimally. Okay, so that's episodic writing. Very often, this is what people think subplots are. They'll create a subplot that's just out there in the ethers. It doesn't have any connection whatsoever to the mainline story, but it's an interesting digression in time or place or character backstory that the author thinks is really important, but it doesn't have any plot or character connection necessarily to what's going on in what we call the A-line story, which is the adventure, your protagonist's main story. That's the A-line. B through Z are all your subplots. Again, I talk about this in the subplot class, but episodic writing and disconnected subplots are very interchangeable in many ways. Jason and the Argonauts is a great example of a mythic story structure, Greek myth, Jason and the Argonauts, Jason going after the Golden Fleece, where he comes up against the Minotaur, and then he beats the Minotaur, and then he comes up against the Harpies, and then he loses some men there, and they all die, but he wins. He kind of gets out alive, gets the next pointer to where the Golden Fleece is, then goes and takes on the next baddie, and etc. Very episodic. It's all held together by the search for the Golden Fleece, but you still feel like there's just this boom, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. So many writers write this way, and it's not bad. It's not wrong. It's what we talked about earlier. Every creative choice you make has creative consequences. If you know that's what you're doing, you know the consequence is going to be your pacing is going to suck. It's either going to be way too slow or way too fast. And the main story is going to get diluted dramatically by stakes and tension, dramatic tension, because you have all these episodic breaks in the main narrative line. That's episodic writing, as opposed to what we're going to be talking about a little bit later here, how you avoid that. So that's the biggie. The next one is there's no real clear structure at all in the middle. You don't follow the best practices of story structure. You just kind of wing it. And there's no clear story structure milestones you're writing to. And I'm not talking about 3-act structure or 5-act structure. Acts are useless. They don't do anything. They're just carbuncles on the butt of writing. That's what they are. One day I'm going to do a videotape just on 3-act structure because it pisses me off so much that people even use it. But good luck avoiding it in the screenwriting world. Everybody talks about 3-act structure, 3-act structure. It doesn't help you at all. Not with pacing, not with anything. What helps you is structure, understanding classic story structure beats that have to happen in every story, whether it's a story or a situation. Those beats, those 5 core beats are always there. Sometimes people write things, though, and they don't have any of them, or just 1 or 2 of them. That's a mushy problem, because then you're kind of all over the place, okay? Then there's the problem of the mush that comes from vague or weak stakes. What are stakes? I think we talked about this earlier. Stakes are at the scene level, at the sequence level, multiple scenes strung together to get to a particular deliverable moment, a beat in the story, or a chapter level or whatever. Stakes are something is going to be won or lost, emotional or tangible or both. There are consequences to the winning or the losing, meaning something is going to happen because you got that thing or you didn't get that thing, and that thing that's going to happen is problematic, okay? It's a problem. It must be solved. And those consequences that come from the winning or the losing become ever more consequential as the story moves forward. That's what raising stakes means. Something's going to be won or lost. There's consequences or problems that will be generated from that function of winning or losing it. And those consequences get harder and worse and more consequential as you move through the story. When you don't have clear story stakes, you have no or little story tension. And there's no sense of real strong forward momentum for the protagonist in terms of story stakes. There are weak or little story stakes. That leaves you with a lot of mush. The next piece is a weak cause and effect in scene progression. This is what a lot of people refer to sometimes as the scene sequel problem. The idea of the scene sequel is a very old term. It came about in the 50s or something, or 40s. Some writer developed this idea of the scene sequel. You have a scene, It has an emotional consequence, or something happens that requires a response. That's the sequel to the scene. Scene A happens, creates a problem or a challenge, or a widget has to get picked up or something, which means the protagonist in that scene has to do something next. That is the sequel. I just call that a huge piece of the active protagonist loop, which we're going to review, and we've already talked about earlier in stories versus situations. That lack of cause and effect of scene sequel also gives you terrible mush. There's no clear scene progression that's causing causative and effective. And the last one is passive protagonists. Will give you a lot of mush unless you've got a great mystery or a great puzzle or a great story challenge that's just kick butt exciting. If you don't, say it's one of those, internal angsty, navel gazing, family library dramas, you better not have a passive protagonist. Passive protagonists are defined, remember, from the situation module. These are characters who are leaves on the wind, being pushed by events, not driving events, passively reacting, not proactively acting to create their problems. Very passive. Creates a lot of mush. So that's how you define mush. Who cares? So what? You got a mushy middle. Who cares? The readers care. This is where you're going to lose them. Unless your writing is just so brilliant and so beautiful and so prosaic that they don't care that nothing's happening. Or worse, they see something could be happening and it's not. When they're connecting dots that the writer isn't connecting, because the story math, you know me, I talk a lot about story math. Stuff has to add up. They might be doing the story math in their heads, but the writer isn't. That's just going to piss the readers off tremendously, and they're going to bail. They're going to walk away. So this is the mushy middle problem right here. How do you avoid it? Well, this is what the rest of the course is going to be going over. These are the structures that you must have in place in order to execute all the hard work you did earlier, coming up with a moral component and a chain of change, a change process. This is where the change process unfolds structurally. Classic story structure and the narrative middle engine, or what I call the pattern of decline and the pattern of elevation. These are structures. Classic story structure is classic story structure. I didn't create it. No guru created this. Nobody did. But every guru who talks about story is touching on the classic structure. They have to if they're talking about stories, because every story has a structure. This is it. Now, you can add lots of embellishments to those, like the Save the Cat 15 beats and 21 this and the 7 that and the 5 act. There's a bunch of different kinds of systems out there that add on to this with proprietary stuff. And I'm guilty of some of that too. I've got some add-ons that I've thrown on the end. You're going to see when you get to the pattern of elevation later on. I've added a few structure steps, that you can or cannot pay attention to. It's up to you. But I think they make sense, structural sense, but they always operate within the context of the classic story structure. And the narrative middle engine are those two other patterns. Classic story structure is pure action, pure plot. Now, again, plot is what happens on the page. What happens on the page is determined by who the protagonist is, what they do on the page. Character and plot are inseparable. The alien invasion stuff has nothing to do with character, has nothing to do with the protagonist. Okay, the monster outside, unless they were Frankenstein and created the monster. But there are things that happen in stories that are action oriented, that are much big part of the high concept and the entertaining value of the story that the protagonist didn't have anything to do with. These are the external challenge, right? The global problem, as some people call it. They're not responsible for that, but they react out of their blind spot, so it's relevant. Okay. But that is the classic story structure. It's the narrative middle engine of these other two patterns that make everything work. So there's 5 beats to the classic story structure. Okay. Inciting incident, midpoint complication, do moment, final battle, change/resolution. How does the story end? Okay. Inciting incident is the event or series of events that are very closely related to each other in story time. We're not talking about, years apart, usually a single event, a knock on the door, Gandalf shows up at the party, we're off to the races. So the inciting incident is the thing that kickstarts the A-line story. It's Your characters on a lifeline, they're following a line in their life of how they're living. The inciting incident occurs, boom, they're shoved off into a whole new direction. That's the aliens invading. That's the monster showing up outside for the first time, whatever it is. Something happens that changes the trajectory of the lifeline of the character, and we're off to our main adventure. That's the inciting incident. Midpoint complication. It's the midpoint, wherever that is in your book, more or less. You can be a little before, a little after. It's not about, being crazy about the middle. But this is where a key plot problem occurs, a complication occurs, and a key character moment occurs. So the example I always use is John and Mary, the secret agents, right? They're chasing the terrorists in Lower Manhattan. And at the midpoint, let's call them Tom and Mary, because I remember Tom and Mary better. I forgot who I called them. So Tom figures out, who's the protagonist, that the bomb that the terrorist is going to blow up in the subway station isn't just a bomb. Tens of people might get killed, but it's a dirty bomb, and hundreds of thousands of people could be killed because of the radiation. That is a plot action ratchet up. Oh my God, but there's no going back now. We have got to get into this. So that's the action complication. It's now a much harder problem, much more consequence. Consequences have to become more consequential. We just ratcheted up stakes. But there's also a character component to this in terms of what I call personal stakes. Community stakes are the community is much more in danger now outside of the main character and the love affair that's driving the middle. The personal stakes are not just that Tom could die too and Mary. Personal stakes are at the same time Tom discovers terrorist has a dirty bomb, he discovers the terrorist is actually his old buddy Ben from SEAL Team 6 Days, who's gone rogue and who he's going to have to shoot. His best friend also happens to be Mary's brother. So now he's got to kill Mary's brother and his best friend, and he's having a love affair with Mary. So this is really going to impact his love life. That's personal stakes, relationship stakes. Something happens at the middle that ratchets the danger for everyone, or the threat for everyone, or the complicating factors for everyone. But at the same time, the core relationship driving the story, the love affair, mother-son story, the father-daughter story, the brother-sister story, the buddy story, whatever the core relationship is driving the middle of the book, also ratchets up stakes for that relationship. Ideally, most people don't do that second part. They only have the first piece. Mazel tov, if that's the case. At least you got 50% of it right. Try to get both. Okay, that's the midpoint complication. Then the doom moment comes. We're 3/4 of the way through the book now. We've gone through a lot of stuff. I'm going to talk about the first and second complications in a second. The doom moment is all is lost. You've seen this a billion times. You've seen it in every imaginable story. You've seen it in every TV show. You've seen it in every movie. You've read it in every book that works. There's always that moment 3/4 of the way through where all is lost. Dark night of the soul, visit to death, whatever the guru wants to call it. I call it the doom moment. It is the point in the story where the protagonist is the farthest from their goal they've ever been. It looks like the bad guy is going to win the day and get the goal. The character wants the truck. They want the money. They want the whatever. Looks like the bad gal's going to get it instead. The protagonist is isolated, alone, separated from the team, whatever it is. It's all is lost. And the character comes to the conclusion, not that they have to change, but they can't keep going on the way they've been going because the old plan isn't working, folks. They need a new plan. So this is the beginning of that pattern of elevation. If you look below, this is when the pattern of elevation starts, where they start rising up out of the mud. And then there's a whole series of things that are going to happen that we'll talk about in a second, leading them to pulling the plan together, pulling the team back together, figuring out how they're going to take on the bad gal. And then you have the final battle where they have it out with the evil forces in the form of, Sauron or whoever the face of evil is in the story, the key alien woo-woo, whatever it is, over control of the goal. And in that final battle, this is where the protagonist rips off that scab. Remember, we talked about the scab and the wounding, the thing that covering over the thing that died in that chain of emotional change. They rip it off here in the battle to reveal again the strength they killed in their wound, to reaccess it now in a new way on steroids. And they use that in action to do the next bit, which is to change and come up with the problem that will solve the problem, the global story problem. Stop the invasion, kill the monster, whatever it is. By accessing that thing they've just revealed in the final battle, they will realize, I have to change. That's where the change happens in the battle. From the do moment to the battle, they're slowly figuring out they're the problem. I got to do something here about myself, but I don't quite know what yet. They don't figure it out until they have the battle. Now, how you get in and out of all of that that's the creative writing part. But structurally, these are the things that always happen. So the first complication, second complication, those are only there because you're going to have lots of complications in your book. Between the inciting incident and the midpoint, you want at least 3 really good ones. Same thing between midpoint and do moment. You want at least 3 really good complicating things that happen. Reversals are simply complications, but they're taking expectations that you've set up and reversing that expectation. The person you thought was an ally is really a bad guy. The person you thought was their mother is actually really their brother. Okay, they're these reversal reveals. But these are things that you use to help raise stakes, to keep momentum going, building those beats to those core structure beats. Okay, that's the classic story engine. If you only do these and you don't worry about moral component and all of that, you have a situation. This is how situations operate. There's no moral problem driving the character. But if you do have a moral problem, if you do have that chain, then you have 2 other patterns that are folded over this, called the pattern of decline and the pattern of elevation. The pattern of decline is what happens to them emotionally from the inciting incident to the doom. The character is going downhill all the way. They might have a couple of inklings, like I said earlier, where they see the light, but they always have the rug pulled out. And they always have to end up at the doom moment. They're at their lowest emotional self. The worst expression of their blind spot is in play. It's a downhill ride from inciting incident to the doom, which is 3/4 of your book. That gives you a very clear emotional road to walk over the course of the middle that would otherwise be very mushy. This is the clothesline all the clothes are hanging off of. You can have episodic moments going on. You can have things going on that seem like they're out of the blue and, just kind of throwing them in there. As long as you don't have too many of them that'll upset the pacing, you're okay. It's not bad and wrong. But as long as you have that pattern of decline going and that person is going down, 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 every time they make a choice, it takes them down a ratchet a little bit more emotionally. That pattern of decline helps you keep that narrative engine going and gives you a narrative through line, character narrative through line that holds it together over the course of most of your book. And then you do the exact same thing for the last quarter, which is the pattern of elevation. They come out of that, and we're going to go into great detail about these patterns of decline and elevation in later modules. So don't worry about if you don't understand this all. We're going to get into the mud on all these things. But that pattern of elevation is they're coming up out of that mud. They thought they've lost everything. Now they see a way back up, but they've got to do a whole bunch of things to get to that final battle to take on the bad guy. So that's the pattern of elevation, which is them accessing slowly their emotional strengths, the will to win, that I'm not the bad, terrible thing I thought I was. I think I can do this. Okay. Now, again, as soon as they win that battle, they're going to get what they want. They're going to get their story goal met. Story's over. You don't go on for 50 more pages. It's all anticlimactic at that point. You got to get out of the book. You got to end the damn thing. Unless they're not going to get what they really want. They're going to get part of what they want. It's book 1 of a series. And you're going to be launching book 2 with some really cool ending you're going to come up with at the end of book 1, right? That's problematic. That's creating new challenges for them. So it's this pattern of decline and pattern of elevation that are operating over the top of the classic story structure engine. That's how you avoid the mush. The first one, the classic story, is reliant on story structure best practices itself. The second one, with the pattern of decline and elevation, is pure moral component driven. So if you don't have a clear moral component and a chain of emotional change process in place, you're not going to be able to do those 2 patterns effectively. Okay? That's how you avoid the mush. We talked about the moral component, right? It's that chain of emotional change, but it's also these 3 elements: the moral blind spot, which is the lie they tell themselves, the protagonist tells him or herself, about who and what they think they are as a person, but they're blind to it. They put that in their subconscious, but they're acting in the world in such a way that's hurting other people. Their behavior is revealing to everyone around them their blind spot. That's the immoral effects. They're acting immorally. Again, not putting pins in the eyeballs of puppy dogs. It might just be that they're not emotionally available in that internal angsty drawing room, family drama, they're just not available. That's hurting other people. Okay. And then there's this dynamic moral tension, which is how they're acting badly versus how they should be acting. That offer refusal loop, remember? Oh, no, we haven't talked about that yet. We'll get into that when we get into uh, pattern of elevation. So those three, the dynamic moral tension is always about how they're acting badly, how they're hurting others versus what they should be doing. That's the dynamics. The story is always asking them if they're ready to change. And they always say no in that middle part. Later on, at the end, in that we call the truth moment, they will take the last offer. Do you want to change here? They'll say yes. And that's where we get into the battle. That's where we get into all the cool stuff and we start changing. Okay, but these are the components, elements that build that moral component. And all of that rests on this whole idea of the active protagonist loop. And for all of this, you've got to have this in place and operating the way we talked about it earlier on. We talked about stories versus situations. What you're going to see, though, you see that problem consequence, proactive choice, proactive effect, and then it loops back where they're locked into that sequence throughout the middle of your book. There's another loop that's operating, I just alluded to in my comments earlier about offering to change and always refusing. It's the offer refusal loop. That's also operating here, okay, right over the top of this one. And we're going to see a little bit later how that loop influences this whole process and how it's totally defined by moral. But this active protagonist loop is critical for helping you avoid that mushy middle because it's all dependent on having a moral blind spot. And if you don't do this, you're going to be doing this. This is what you're going to have. Passive protagonist loop. Again, not bad, not wrong. I'm not judging any stories or anybody's writing process. It's just a matter of what I say about being a conscious writer. Know what you're writing, know how you're going to do it, know why you're writing it the way you're writing it. Know what you've got so that you can be informed. If you have a situation, remember we talked about this earlier on. If you have a situation, you don't have to worry about moral components. Out of the woods on that one. You still have to be fun and entertaining and complex and all of that stuff. You still have to do all that. If you have a story, you got to do all that plus have a moral component and have that all work. It's a lot more difficult. So if you have a situation, know that's what you've got because then you know how to write it. What you don't have to do, you don't have to worry about forcing that foot into the shoe with that moral component thing. It's just going to feel forced and unnatural. So figure out your core structure. Get those 5 core beats. Figure it out very mechanically. What are those beats going to be? And the midpoint complication and the do moment all have very clear character elements to them, not just action elements. Midpoint, the core relationship will be put in danger at the midpoint, and at the do moment, the character is going to realize they're at their lowest emotional self and that this is unacceptable because of what's happened, because of the thing that happens that throws them into doom. What does the bad guy gal do that looks like they're going to beat the protagonist? That's the action thing that happens. The emotional beat that happens is they're at their worst self and they see it. This is the first time they really see it. You see how that immediately deepens everything when you can do that. And if you don't have a moral component, you will not be able to do the narrative engine middle piece. You just won't have that pattern of decline and elevation because you don't have the change process that's going to work. All right. So just to review, these are the things that you're trying to avoid with mushy middle by using those 3 key patterns: classic story structure pattern, pattern of decline, pattern of elevation. All 3 of those work in harmony to help you to avoid all these little nasty things. All right. So that is how you avoid the mushy middle. That's the mushy middle problem and how you avoid it.